2 weeks later. Dayton and Adrian knocked on the home, though more a mansion, of the Albanus family. They wanted to observe Damascus, who was now 12. The large wood door opened, and to their surprise, it was Damascus himself, a boy who was well groomed, his black hair cut short and combed back, and his dark brown eyes framed with outlandishly long eyelashes. His skin was milky white, with the perfect rosiness to his cheeks. "Hello, we have been expecting you." Damascus opened the door wide. Dayton motioned Adrian to enter first. Mr. Albanus came from around the corner to greet his guests. He was not fond of having them in his home, but he put on a gracious smile for his wife. "You must be Mr. Dayton." "And Ms.?" He was at a loss for Adrian's last name. "Just call me Adrian." "All right. Come into the den. My wife is waiting for you with some tea." Mr. Albanus closed the door and patted Damascus on the head. The guests followed them into the expensively decorated den. Dayton was always uncomfortable around people of such wealth. In fact, he didn't like wealthy people at all. He found them greedy and spoiled, and a waste of their own money. Their wealth could feed a small, hungry country. But no, they sit in their mansions, decorated with the finest art and china that money could buy. What a waste, he thought to himself as he looked around the environment. "Please, have some tea." Mrs. Albanus motioned for them to serve themselves. They both sat in plush velvet chairs facing the couch where Damascus and Mrs. Albanus were seated. Mr. Albanus stood at the bar and poured himself bourbon on the rocks. "What have you found out about Damascus's relatives?" "That's why you're here. To give us news of his birth parents?" she asked. Mr. Albanus took a large swig of his drink. "Well, we haven't been able to find much. The language stitched onto his baby blanket is still unknown. We feel if we can place an excerpt of it in the paper and see if anyone can come forward with knowledge of its peculiarity, it would be a great help," Adrian said. Mr. Albanus blurted out, "Absolutely not. My son is not a sideshow. He is an intelligent, talented young boy and he doesn't need to know his birth parents. We are his parents. Furthermore, I did some research on you, Mr. Dayton." Mr. Albanus motioned for Damascus to leave the room. Mrs. Albanus tried to stop him, but he ignored her, continuing, "So you study the acts of demonology. I read your research on the subject, and I found it quite disturbing." He finished his glass of bourbon. "Mr. Albanus," Adrian said, "we are not here to challenge you. We are trying to come to some conclusion of who left your son on the steps of the Holy Office and why. That's all, trust me." "So how much is the church paying you?" "I am sure they are paying you to prove that my son is a demon. My wife told me what she saw on that tape." He walked closer to Dayton, ignoring Adrian. "I will pay you much more than what the church could ever pay to stop this witch hunt and leave us alone." Mrs. Albanus looked mortified at her husband's allegations. Dayton put down his tea on the table next to him and rose from his chair. "Well, I think we are done here. Adrian, let's take our leave." "Thank you, Mrs. Albanus, and if you can help us in any way, let us know." Mr. Albanus sounded off as the last word. "Give us back our son's blanket." Adrian agreed. "I will have one of my staff deliver it here tomorrow." They left the mansion unescorted and headed for the rental. Dayton felt a twinge of pain like a pinch in the back of his neck. He turned around and looked up at the second-story window. There he stood, Damascus in silhouette. April the 26th, 2007. Red ordination 10 o'clock, in the season of the goddess of Luna, the ritual was being prepared for Damascus. Tonight he would attain his priesthood and be baptized of his father's full anointing and receive the keys to the stewed priesthood. He placed on his ceremonial clothing with the help of Menad, his step-brother. A black robe touched the top of his bare feet, with a red sash tied about his waist. A wide red satin sash fell around his neck, extending to his waist with the hierarchy of priesthood beehive symbol sewn in gold. A saucer-shaped black hat laid snugly around his head. Menad placed a green apron about his waist to remind him of the fallen in the Garden of Eden. Because of this rebellion, all was attained by Satan to rule the world and collect souls forevermore. Damascus knelt by a stone altar in the red forest of Pripyat, Ukraine, near the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. The forest was red with nuclear activity, which made it the perfect source of power for Damascus to absorb and channel. 12 men came out of the red forest and made a circle around him. They wore hooded cloaks, similar to their prophet, seer and revelator. Menad stood by Damascus' side, as his attendant in the ceremony. All the cloaked 12 apostles put their left elbow on the right shoulder of the apostle next to them, with their right arm to the Masonic square, with palms extended, fingers together. In their left hands they held in front of them a black staff that reached to the floor. The head of the staff was a gold bee. All was quiet. The full moon appeared to drip red as the leaves in the forest absorbed the hue. Menad placed his hand on Damascus's right shoulder and announced the arrival of his father, the prophet of all evil, Samil. The apostles began a low, methodical, musical hum. Samil knelt on the other side of the altar, facing Damascus, his son. His attendants removed his black cloak, exposing his human-like features. They placed a gold robe on his shoulders, and clipped it in front with a gold medallion in the shape of a dagger. Let us begin with the patriarchal anointing. Place your hands in the patriarchal grip. Menad took out a silver vial that held blessed oil. Damascus's and Samil's hands intertwined. Menad anointed Damascus with the power of the stewed priesthood. A slight wind rustled the red leaves and scattered the loose ones about. A man approached out of the woods and passed through the apostles and into the circle. He was the archangel of hell. He held a bone-carved vial filled with sediments of unknown sacred origins to finish the anointing of the last antichrist of the world. Samat thy earth of Carmetning, I have full power anoint you, Damascus, the true son of Samil, with this oil. I anoint your head that you may be aware of all men's souls and lead them to the gates of your Father. The archangel of hell placed his finger lubricated with the oil on Damascus's forehead and drew an X. I anoint your eyes that you may see the path that lies ahead of you. I anoint your mouth that you may speak the words of your Father to accomplish your great mission. I anoint your heart that you may listen to it as you rule the world. I anoint your spine as it may be fluid in all deception, and consecrate your loins that you may bear fruit of this world, and use it as a vehicle of your own desire. I anoint the soles of your feet that you may walk and not be weary, run and not be faint. Damascus felt a surge of electric power with each touch from the archangel. He looked into the red eyes of his father and smiled. Arise, O Holy One, and receive a blessing from your Father. The archangel backed away and flew into the forest, leaving a foul stench of death behind. Come, my son, and kneel down before me. Damascus knelt before his father beneath the red moon. He held his breath as his father administered all the keys of the kingdom upon his head, and announced him in full power to begin his mission of ruling this world. Cozy Sia. So it begins. Chapter 2. Lilith's Children, year 2010. Dayton retreat into his home in Harrison, New York, USA. He needed some time away from his years of researching church scrolls and observing Damascus's life. He needed to relax with friends and visit his 90-year-old aunt. She resided in the home he had purchased some years ago. It stood on 4 acres of lush green land in the Hudson River Valley. The 45-minute drive from JFK Airport to Harrison was well worth the effort for the beauty, serene rolling hills, and wildlife. It was a village for the affluent only. Dayton's elderly aunt was his father's oldest sister and only living relative on that side. She was a spunky, jewelry-dripping, thinly wrinkled woman who was outrageous with her Clyrol auburn-colored hair with 2 inches of absolute white halo grow out. Aunt Jules, he called her. Her full-time caregiver was a friendly Asian woman whom Dayton paid well for her 24-hour, in-home care. "What's money for?" he always commented as he doled out a wad of cash for her services. He left the confines of the bustling New York City and headed to Harrison. The stress melted away as the green vegetation grew and prospered under the morning dew. The low-lying fog slowly filmed each leaf with its heavy moisture. The mist expanded as he arrived closer to his home. He turned on his fog lights and windshield wipers to follow the road up the hill, which was barely visible. He caught a glimpse of the two-level stone house. He smiled as he pulled into the front driveway, turned off the car and pushed the garage door opener. Dayton loved this home, but loved Paris as a whole much more. Dayton entered the garage, smiling at his Aunt's silver 1952 Jaguar Mark 7 sedan, still in impeccable shape. He always took her for a long ride in it when he came into town. Dayton closed the garage door with a push of the button and entered into the mudroom where he set down his luggage and duffel bag. A squeal came from the living room, and his aunt smiled with her arms outstretched. She sat upright in her favorite brown lounge chair. Dayton embraced her bag of bones and admired once again her flaming auburn hair that looked slightly too bright red this time. She was all dolled up in lacy white top and purple slacks, with matching purple orthotic shoes with a wide heel. As always, she had on too many necklaces, and every arthritic finger had either large diamonds or her birthstone amethyst rings. Her ears dripped with dangling pearl earrings that nearly pulled her wrinkled earlobe down to her chin. He laughed at the sight of her. She slapped both her hands to encase his full face and kissed him with a pucker on the lips. "Oh, Aunt Jules, it's good to see you. Sweetie, it's been too long." "Yes, it has, hasn't it?" The Asian caregiver appeared carrying his suitcases, and said she had set up his room for him. After a long reminiscence at brunch, Dayton took his leave from Aunt Jules and went to work in the office next to his bedroom on the second floor. His aunt lived on the first floor due to her inability to climb stairs, so Dayton set up the second level to his liking and comfort. His office, full of dark mahogany wood bookshelves and a matching large desk, exuded a luxury every man liked. It was a strong room, unlike the one he had in Paris. He resided in a large flat. His office there was one desk, a few small bookshelves, and a table with stacks of research papers and ancient books. Harrison, New York afforded him the luxury of style. He warmed up his Apple computer, which was linked to all his research in the libraries. He shuffled through the research papers he'd brought with him. Dayton decided to start an in-depth research on Lilith and the name Menad, which were two names that kept coming up in the scrolls. Lilith's known in many religious texts as the first Eve, who rebelled against God. God banned her from the Garden of Eden and placed Adam into a deep sleep, removing one of his ribs and placing it in Eve. There are many factual and fantasy books written on Lilith. She had become a myth due to the thought that God had made a mistake in her creation. Dayton pulled up on his computer screen a scripted scroll found in the secular tomb of an ancient king in Egypt that the church purchased in the 1900s. He spent 5 years studying and writing a synopsis of the scrolls, and this is how he interpreted them, Scroll 1 through 5. Due to Lilith's misfortune in the grand paradise of Eden, she not only became the first witch of Menad, but she also consorted many centuries with the fallen angel, Samil. He was one of God's angels who fell in love with her, and they begat several children born under heaven's curse. All their children became drinkers of blood, human and animal alike. Her first 3 children, Etim, Tand and Fiftiak, were the most ruthless drinkers of the men of Adam. A fable stated that Adam's first sons, Cain and Abel, were protected by God until Cain rebelled and fell in love with Lilith. He was stripped of his heavenly protection due to his commitment to her. In the beginning, Cain's jealousy was unrestrained. God loved Abel more. Cain created a way to deceive his brother Abel into committing fornication in a drunken state. As he did commit this sin, Abel's protection from God was dissipated for a time, giving Lilith's children opportunity to feed on his blood, draining it all from his body. Cain then carried the lifeless body of his brother to the forest of Lilith and burnt it up in an offering to Lilith and Menad. God was in need of Abel and could not find him anywhere, but he did find Cain laboring in the fields and asked Cain, "Where is Abel?" Cain was angered by this question and raged at God. "Am I my brother's keeper?" God cursed him to live for all the centuries of the world and cast out of God's presence forever. God made him a mix of animal and human with his entire lineage under the same curse. Lilith delighted in the first feeding of man. Her children became 18 in all, and they were blessed with the desire to feed on man. Several bordered on mindlessness and waited for the last seal to be broken, for all men that were left on earth before Armageddon will be at their mercy of prey, if they do not hold the mark of their master, which is 666. Some of Lilith's children have renounced their vamphood and refused to participate in the evil feedings on man. They held disciples in their cults, which were known as obfuscates, and have their own prophet, Worm. They have distanced themselves from Lilith and the other cults and laid in hiding until the last days. Incarnu and Sanvaro were the most dangerous cults of vampires. They waited for all those that were cloaked under the promise of God for protection to sway in evil and break the laws of God, so they may come forth and feed on their souls first, then drink their blood. Introduction of the fallen angel. Samuel is the eldest brother to Nephi, who was also a fallen angel. Nephi walked between heaven and hell. Nephi held the highest priesthoods in the upper quadrant of heaven, and his wife, Maldanian, loved him passionately, and her happiness was all they knew until Nephi's last earth life. He was a Roman warrior and a murderer of thousands, and he loved death and killing. The rest of the scroll was too faded or missing to interpret more than this. Scroll 6 through 10. Dayton's interpretation. Nephi was a large man in stature with a chiseled face and black tightly curled hair, and he had a slight beard groomed in the latest Roman fashion of tightly wound curls. His left ear was pierced and held a golden calf dangling from the gold hoop. He was filthy with men's blood all over his body. He entered his tent. The night held a plenitude of stars that lit up the darkness. The moon was full and low to the flatlands of Greece. He grunted in soreness as he removed his blood-soaked clothes from about his loins. A bath was set up by servant girls and young men dressed as women, which amused Nephi. He doused himself in the bath scented with myrrh and oils. It calmed his nerves. Tremere aroused from his bed and danced for him. His eyes embarked at her beauty and dark-skinned body. Her eyes fell upon him again, and again he could not look away. She held him under her spell. Tremera's dark red hair touched her waist and followed her motions of pure seductiveness. Her hips were round, and stomach flat and tight, her arms slender and her bosoms full and lush. She was only covered by a sheer blue material that elevated Nephi's intoxication. The material swayed with her slithering moves. He was exhausted from the fight at Gehenna, which the Romans won, slaughtering thousands of farmers and statesmen of the land. "What is your name?" Nephi rose from his bath, as a male dressed in women's clothing dried him with a white cloth. My name is." She twirled around his body. "Tremera." She smiled and kissed his lips lightly. He groaned as he wrapped a gold accordion cloth about him, tucking it in the side to stay in place. "Where are you from? You don't look Roman, or even Greek." His highest-ranked officer stormed into the tent, as a servant reported to him of a strange woman in Nephi's tent. He pulled his sword and held her at bay with its sharp, blood-stained edge. Tremera stopped her dancing and covered herself with the nearest bedding. The officer demanded she report who she was. The officer, Tamand, was 6'4" with graying hair that fit tight to his head. His nose was large and crooked from many breaks in battle. His breastplate was blood-stained with the day's killings, excited Tremera. The smell of blood brought a heightened sense to her emotions. Nephi grabbed her arm, which caused the bedding to fall. He inspected every inch of her body to see if any weapon could be concealed. Nothing. He only delighted at her perfect form. Nephi waved his officer to leave. Tamar reluctantly obeyed. Alone, wrapped in each other's arms, they kissed passionately for a time until Tremere began to change into her real state of vamphood. She brought Nephi to his knees as she drained his blood until just before death. She turned him to Lilith's side of blood drinkers. He lived for many decades, creating havoc and chaos among mortal men. The prophet worm hunted Nephi until they met and battled. The prophet worm casted a stake into Nephi's heart, which caused it to stop. Nephi's spirit descended out of his cursed body and was greeted by Adam of Eden, the first father of all. Nephi, you have followed the sorcery of Lilith and murdered many of God's good children. This act will not be unpunished. You will be cursed all the days of your life and all the days of earth. Nephi, I will give you your human body once again, thus you will need to establish for God that you have repented. All your keys and priesthoods will be hidden from you. There will be enmity between you and those born of God. You will still have visions and tests to challenge you to commit once again to worthiness and regain all that you had. Your temptations will be great and ominous. You are a half-angel who has fallen. Adam bent down over Nephi's body and removed the stake from his heart. It began to beat and Nephi's spirit was sucked into it by an inhaled breath. He rose to his feet and faced Adam. Go now and leave my presence. Nephi bowed his head, and understood all that was told to him, feeling overwhelmed with guilt and shame. He wandered the earth forever. He continued to search for the return of his love from heaven, Maldanian. Worm was not so gracious. He scowled and groaned that Adam took away his victory and let Nephi alive. He's human once again. He is no threat to you anymore. You will not touch a hair on his head or you will be smitten to dust. Adam then vanished into the sky. Worm cursed him and went back to his village of vampires. Dayton realized he had been at it for several hours, trying to reel in the scrolls of vamphood. This could never be a fact. Was the writer of the scrolls just that, a writer of make-believe? His interpretation of the scrolls remained only with him and the Catholic Church. They would never be made public due to the strange context.